Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is Wednesday, it is the 18th day of December, and a week from today is Christmas Day. And so that kind of gets our feet on the ground and gets us a little bit oriented as to where we are. It is a pleasure to be with you today. You probably have picked up the fact that we did repeat programs earlier in the week. We had... we did not have production capabilities available, so we postponed for the first couple of classes, programs rather, and we've just been talking about next week, which is Christmas week, and plans right now are to do a program on Monday and then not do one on Tuesday and Wednesday. I'm scheduled to try to drive to New England for the holidays. We're planning to leave on Christmas Eve morning, Tuesday morning next week, and drive right through, and to turn around and come back fairly quickly then the following weekend. And that's a little bit up in the air at this point, but we will be doing a program on Monday, unless something unforeseen happens. And I don't like to be away too long because, to be very honest with you, I really miss doing the program. I get rusty and I collect my resources, but at the same time, I don't do it with the intensity and the acumen that, you notice the word acumen? That's a pretty good word for a Wednesday, isn't it? But I'm serious. One of the things I do notice is that when the pressure of the program in the afternoon is there, I find that I tend to not only read much more quickly, but also that I tend to be much more tuned in, much more perceptive to the in-between-the-lines stuff than I am. If there's no program, I read it and I find it interesting. If I find it really interesting to the point that it might be something that I really would like to bring to the Virtual Center and share with you, then I'll print it and kind of put it aside. And I have a pile of materials, with that in mind. But at the same time, you don't read them quite as intensely as you do when there's a program coming in the afternoon. And so consequently, when I do go back and pick up a piece and say, well, I think I'm going to deal with this today, and then I look at it and and suddenly say, gee, I didn't really pick up, what the real essence of this article was. And I find that I just don't read as carefully or as I do when the pressure of the program is upon us. And so I miss being here, and I hope that you feel somewhat the same way. I've gotten some wonderful emails from listeners. Our friend Scott in Sweden sent me just a delightful email over the weekend, and very, very complimentary email. I appreciate it so much. And anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I was just sharing with Bob Kincaid and the folks at Head On in the studio that the stock market, I just happened to glance. The stock market today is up over 230 points. Apparently, the Fed announced that beginning in January, it was going to slow down, not materially, but gradually, begin the slowdown of the Fed's monthly purchase of Treasury bonds as part of the Fed's effort to stimulate the economy. And the thinking is that job growth and economic development has actually been a lot stronger than we suspected it was, and so consequently, Director Bernanke announced today that beginning in January, the Fed would purchase $10 million less in Treasury bonds. And of course, the average has been $85 million a month. And So $10 million less than that, it doesn't seem to be that significant. But it's having an impact on the market because the people who control the market are beginning to see this as a statement from the Fed that the economy is indeed getting stronger, and that's driven the Dow Jones up, and so it's up well over 16,000 now, and I have a program that I want to do on the market, and on the Dow and on retirement. You know, how we handle our retirement, how we deal with our 401ks and various things. And I've been kind of holding that in abeyance. You know, sometime during the holidays or immediately after that, maybe we can do that. Again, it is a pleasure to be with you today. Let me give you our phone numbers and encourage you to share your ideas and your thinking with all of us here as we move through the holiday season. We would love to hear from you. I would. And I know our listeners would appreciate hearing from you as well. Our phone number is area code 304, and the number is 658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. The last time that we were together in a live program was a week ago today, and in the last half hour of our 2-hour time together, I had approached an article and begun to deal with an article by Stanley Fish that was in the New York Times at that time about a week ago, and I mentioned the fact that at our next time together, which I presumed was going to be this past Monday, but we were unable to do a program. I wanted to revisit that article, and indeed I want to do that. But I received an email this weekend from Betsy in Texas, and Betsy emails me quite regularly, and I appreciate it so much. And most of what she has to say is just so poignant and so important. Because she's in the classroom and she's struggling trying to teach young middle school students, and but she was kind enough to share with me a poem that one of her students wrote, and she wanted me to see it, and I did, and she obviously was quite concerned about it, as am I, and to the point that I really thought I would share it with you because it's pretty powerful stuff. The title of it is School, and let me read it, and then we can talk about it. It goes like this: School is so boring. No one pays attention. I'm sleeping and I'm snoring. I get detention. Some people actually like it. I don't need school. Maybe just a bit. I'd rather be in the pool. My mom makes me go. Now I know how it feels. I wish it would snow. Now let me get on my heels. And then at the end of that, the student writes the following: I was not ready for this kind of thing, but I'm taking the risk. Many people really like this thing called school. My opinion of school is that it's boring and everything I said in my poem. I mean, what's the point of going to school? Now let me go to the place I don't want to mention. School is as horrible as going to jail. And Betsy thought that I would, be interested in that because she thought, especially the last line about it's as horrible as going to jail, was very, very sad. And she basically flagged counselors to talk to the student. It was a 7th grader that wrote this. I don't think there's anything in there that surprises any of us, maybe, except that the child, first of all, it rhymed. A lot of it rhymed, which I think is good. I think also the fact that the student took the time to write it at all is significant. And the fact that it rhymes is even more significant. but I would suggest that there probably would be a lot of students who might say something like that. I just finished a college class. I turned in my grades yesterday, in fact, and it was interesting because we had a Christmas event last evening here in southern West Virginia in Beckley, and one of the guests at our dinner was the president of the local college here, where the University of Charleston, where I'm teaching the class, and he was asking me how the class went, and how I enjoyed it and those kinds of things, and I told him that that I was kind of disappointed because a couple of the students didn't take it really seriously. I didn't know quite how to say it, but their attendance was spotty. Performance was really not up to par. And again, this first, I didn't know these people ahead of time, so you might say, well, how can you know what par is if you hadn't experienced them before? Well, the fact of the matter is they are in college, and as such, you kind of have in mind a particular bar. A particular standard, and the assumption is that college level work does not go below that. And in a couple of cases it did. And I don't mean that it was any problem with the student, because to be very honest with you, a couple of the students, of my students, were international students for whom English is a second language, and so the fact that I give all written exams and take-home papers and those kinds of things, and students are required to write and think and all of that, sometimes really stresses international students because they're not as fluid in the language as native-born youngsters or students are, and of course that makes perfect sense. And what I try to do is I'm not grading. I mean, I'm not grading grammar and those kinds of things necessarily. It is a history class. What I'm trying to do is determine the depth and the level of understanding of the concepts and the issues that the particular students are writing about. And what I'm looking for is a grasp. And I find that, and this gets into my methodology, but I find essay exams to be the best for that because it gives students an opportunity to tell you exactly what they know. And if you give them choice, that allows them to go to the issues that they feel that they have the most to say on. And so in a sense, you're creating a kind of situation where they're saying, even though I could answer any question theoretically, I'm supposed to be able to answer any question on these exams. Given the choice you give me, these are the ones I choose because these are the issues I know best. And I tell them that, I expect them to prove that. And so when they pick a question, I'm assuming that the reason they took that rather than the other choices was because they know it better. And so therefore, I go in, when I read what they've written, I look for evidence that indeed they did know it very well. The problem is that especially if attendance is not good, an awful lot of what I do in class happens in class. And the fact that students are reading textbooks outside class is fine. But on the other hand, there's so much in the class that you have to be there to pick up. And I'm basically holding them accountable for what we do in class as well as what the required reading is about. And some people, just haven't really established the kind of discipline necessary to make it to class on a regular basis, and so consequently they miss too many classes. And when that becomes a problem is with the choice, because, after a while, if a student has missed too many classes, then there's no way to give them enough choice. And one reason I like to provide choice is because if a student does miss a class, then I don't want to make them take that particular issue when they weren't there that day. So by providing some sort of choice, it gives students the opportunity to get around an occasional absence. But if absence becomes extensive, then there's no way to provide that kind of choice. And in a sense, what they're saying to me is you don't really have enough to evaluate me on, because I haven't been here enough to really have taken the class. And that's and a couple of that applied to a couple of students in the class. But remember, we're looking at a 7th grader's poem here. And I think we see, at least what I see is different versions of what's in that poem at different levels. And I think it's unfortunate, and it's unfortunate in a lot of ways because I'm grading as if what I'm looking at is the best work that the particular student can do. And of course, that's a faulty assumption in a lot of cases, because in a lot of cases, students are just winging it. I mean, they're just, throwing out this, that, and the other thing, whether what they know belongs in the essay, is called for in the question, or doesn't, whatever. And so in a sense, part of my evaluation is based not only on what's in the essay, but what isn't. Because how well you know a particular topic will pretty well determine what ought to be in there and what ought not to be in there. And so if there's a lot of extraneous information in there that really isn't called for by the question, then you have to assume that the person's understanding of the issue was rather weak, or they just didn't have anything else to say, or whatever. It doesn't matter. So the point, I think what we're talking about is a pervasive point. One of the things I've been doing over the weekend, and I find more and more on this, there is more and more being written at the national level about education. And as more and more data comes in, and as it becomes pretty demonstrable that the quality and caliber of American education is slipping when weighed against other developed nations, the education performance of students in other developed nations, then it's very obvious that a lot of people are writing, are speculating as to why and what's wrong and what we need to do to fix it and all these. So there's a massive information out there, and people are suggesting a lot of different things. And I think what we're beginning to see is almost I'm not saying at this point it's desperation yet, but it's clear that people are realizing that our education system, which used to be the premier education system in the world, is slipping and slipping fast. And people are trying to grab onto issues and reasons that they feel might be a way to stop the slide. And I today, for example, in the New York Times, there was the editorial board of the New York Times wrote an editorial on the op-ed page about reforms, and I wanted to go into that, if we have time today later in the program. If not, we'll come back to it. But again, I find this sad, and again, an awful lot of attention is being given to teachers' colleges, to the way we train our teachers. Other people are focusing on the way we fund our schools. And, of course, the dominant theme throughout the United States forever on funding public education has been property taxes. And by definition, we've known forever that you can't have a uniformly rigorous academic system when funding for your educational system comes from property taxes, because property taxes differ depending on the particular region, state and region of state that the school lies in. So consequently, certain school districts, which are wealthier districts, have much more expensive high tax property in them, which suggests that the schools are going to have a much larger budget to work with than our other school systems. And it seems like we found a way in our own mind to rationalize that. And I think a lot of it goes to this idea that, the realization or the acceptance of the fact that everybody really isn't equal, and there are some people that are more equal than others. There are some people that take education much more seriously than do other people, and it's only right that funding ought to reflect that kind of interest. So the fact that some systems are well funded and some systems are not that well funded has over time been generally accepted as kind of that's just the way it is. But the fact of the matter is that's not just the way it is. And it seems if you really are committed to something called equality of educational opportunity, then it seems to me that you have an obligation to treat everybody the same. And what that means is in terms of resources and in terms of the investment, in terms of the quality of the teachers you hire, in terms of the salaries that you can pay these teachers, in terms of the building and the various other resources that students are given access to. And the fact that somebody through the accident of birth resides in a system where taxes are low because property is quite less valued than it is in other districts, and therefore you have less money to work on. You know, the question is, do we in a republic which is committed to the idea of everybody having as close as we can possibly come to equality of opportunity, do we have an obligation to try to offset these inequities? It's very clear that many of the school systems which have forged ahead of ours, many school systems which have forged, gone by us and left us in the dust, so to speak. And I'm thinking of Finland, and I'm thinking of Canada, and I'm thinking of Shanghai and Singapore and those kinds of places. One of the things you find is that they have made a commitment to equality of opportunity, which is quite a bit more substantive than apparently is ours. And so, you know, many of these nations feel that the state has an obligation to find ways to offset the inequities that come about as a result of the accident of birth, that you are born into a particular family in a particular region, and that you should ultimately pay for that for the rest of your life, and that you never can basically close the gaps and all of that. And these societies have stepped up to the plate and met that challenge, and we've refused to do it in this country. And part of it, I think, is because we have this phobia, and I think that's probably an appropriate word, about entitlements. And the assumption is that with throwing we would be throwing good money after bad, because the fact of the matter is we would be depriving our best students of a high level of educational investment in order to make the investment in all our children more equal. But the fact of the matter is we would be taking from the most gifted and giving it to those who have the least motivation and are less gifted. And that doesn't seem to be a good business decision to a lot of people. And I guess the question is, to what extent is that an excuse? To what extent is that justification for the way it is? We have seen throughout our nation's history all sorts of evidences of what people will do in order to get their children into or out of public school systems to which they've been assigned. We've seen the urban flight in the 60s and 70s from the inner city to the suburbs. We've seen, with the emergence of charter schools in the last 20 years or so, we've seen that flight out of the cities reverse itself, and now many people are coming back into the cities. And ironically, many of the charter schools, many of what we perceive to be our best schools, are now in the cities, and that is in part synonymous with with urban renewal, with the fact that many neighborhoods have been gutted and restored, and of course in the process many of the people who lived in them have been ousted, and the quality of the property has been upgraded into condos, and the only people that can buy into those condos are the more affluent from the suburbs who are coming back into the city. But in a sense, it's not the same people. It's not the same people living in the city and benefiting from the urban renewal that did before. It's kind of like the Gulf after Katrina, where tens of thousands of people were driven from the Gulf. Many of them have never returned. The economy the economies on the Gulf have pretty much recovered, but they are not the same economies, and they are not serving the same people that were there prior to Katrina. So what we've seen is major dislocation within the country, and we choose not to deal with it, with the results of it. And I think we really need to do that. So again, you might be saying, why so much emphasis and attention on education in a program that is focused on the Constitution of the United States? And I would suggest to you there are a number of different areas that you could go for answers to that question. But the most obvious to me is the fact that our system is committed to the ideal of equality of opportunity. And there's no question that in American society there has long been and continues to be an assumption that equality and opportunity in American society is directly tied to the caliber of the education that our young people are provided. And so, in a sense, in order to fulfill the mission of the Republic as outlined in the preamble to the Constitution, it seems to me that it would be the height of folly and naivete to ignore education in a program devoted to the real intent and meaning of the founders and the republic that they created. So I personally am very, very comfortable with focusing on education as being critical, because there's absolutely no question that the degree to which we are able to meet our obligations to approach something resembling equality of opportunity in this society is tied directly to what happens or doesn't happen in our educational system at all levels. In higher education, for example, and this kind of is a segue into the Stanley Fish article that we began to look at a week ago. In higher education, there is real concern, and it's growing, that the public commitment to college education for everybody who would take advantage of it is becoming less and less a reality in American society. As local governments and state governments have reduced aid to public institutions of higher education, the administrations of these colleges and universities have responded by tipping the balance in terms of fundraising away from public support to more private support in terms of foundations and scholarships and grant and the rest. And the result is, to make a long story short, the result is in many of our states and related to many of our most prestigious public institutions of higher education, the burden of funding a college education has been shifted in recent years away from the public in terms of the allocation of tax money and put more and more on the shoulders of students and their families and their supporters and whatever. So in effect, what we see is that public support for higher education is declining. Some places faster than others, but the fact of the matter is there is a general decline in the percentage of a student's college education that is provided by with public support, public funding. And that money is being made up by tuition and fee increases, which in recent years threaten to return the nation to a situation where higher education in America seems more and more to be a function of those who can pay for it. And those who can't are not getting it. And if they are getting it, they're getting an inferior product. And institutions have been, are constantly trying to scale back and reduce expenses and streamline their internal operations and all the rest of it in order to live within these shrinking budgets. But the fact of the matter is the impact of the recent recession of 2007 and 2008 in some states has been felt well before now. In other states, and I'm speaking, one of these states is West Virginia. Up until now, the recession hasn't really seemed to have had a material effect on funding of higher education in West Virginia, but it is now. Public institutions have been mandated by the governor to reduce budgets by 7.5%, with the promise that there will probably be another 7.5% cut in the 2014-2015 academic year. And institutions have basically pared back the product as much as they feel they can without materially affecting the quality of the product. And so now they're in a situation where, and what they're saying is, any more cuts and we're going to have to start laying off personnel and terminating programs. And so there's absolutely no question that higher education in America is undergoing a sea change of monumental proportions. And while all of this is going on, the fact of the matter is that when the numbers are looked at and assessed, the quality and the caliber of the product that we are producing here in America is falling fast in comparison with other nations that technology and the information revolution have made competitors with us. So there's no question that the issue of higher education is part of this conversation. It's not just elementary, it's not just the middle schools and the high schools, it's higher education as well. It's education from the very beginning to the end. At the same time, we must recognize the fact that in terms of higher education, that from all over the world, students continue to come to American colleges and universities because of the caliber of the education that they provide. And again, it's the question is being raised by many people, how much of this is reputation and what used to be, and how much of it it remains valid today. But institutions are going out of their way to encourage and recruit international students to come to study. And very honestly, part of the reason for that is income, because many of these international students, because they are not residents of the state in which the institution of higher education is located, are paying out-of-state tuition Many of them are paying top dollar. And, of course, the fact of the matter is many of them come from families in their countries who have that top dollar. And so we're seeing major issues and major changes here in education, and I think all of it affects the nature of our constitutional system. It affects the mission of the republic that we are blessed to live in. It kind of suggests things we need to do in order to get the train back on track, so to speak. I mentioned last week when we got into this that this article by Stanley Fish, entitled "Scholarship and Politics: The Case of Noam Chomsky," appeared in the New York Times on the 9th of December. Today's the 18th, so it's 9-10 days ago. It is Stanley Fish's account of 3 lectures that Noam Chomsky delivered at Columbia University in the philosophy department as part of what Columbia refers to as the John Dewey Lectures, which are delivered every year to an invited philosopher. And this year in 2013, that invited philosopher was Noam Chomsky, who has spent a number of years at MIT. He's an internationally renowned linguist. He is also a well-known commentator on a number of political, economic, and social issues related to the world we live in today. The fact that this is Noam Chomsky we're talking about is a key factor in assessing the relevance of this particular piece. We started to look at it last week, and I'd like to go back. I'm not going to rely on the fact that people are able to remember for a period which now is extended to 7 days. But basically, the premise, the basic principle of this particular piece by Stanley Fish relates to, as indicated in the title, to the issues of scholarship on the one hand and politics in the other. More specifically, it deals with the issue of academic freedom. Academic freedom has long been a bone of contention in higher education. There is absolutely no question in our past. You can find examples of periods, and this makes perfect sense. This is a historical fact. When nations feel threatened, when people feel that their way of life is under attack, then they naturally tend to move in defense of that system and thereby limit freedom. So consequently, in higher education, it is during periods when Americans felt most under attack that academic freedom becomes a real issue of political debate. It's wonderful to talk about academic freedom in the abstract and say things like, well, the whole idea of the academy, of the classroom in higher education, is the free exchange of ideas based on the assumption that the pursuit of truth is the product of competition in the marketplace of ideas and points of view and issues. In other words, people ought to be free in order to contribute what they believe the issue at hand calls for. And the whole idea of the marketplace of ideas is based on the assumption that those points of view that are the most credible will withstand the competition, and those which are not will fall by the wayside. That the marketplace, the free exchange of ideas and conversation and points of view, is going to serve the very, very positive function of screening out the weakest ideas and suggestions and calling attention to those that are left and are able to withstand the competition in the marketplace, which theoretically is because they are the strongest and most credible ideas and positions and interpretations. The fact of the matter is, that's the ideal. And when times are good, when public opinion in the nation tends to be, tends to be measured in very positive ways, when people don't feel threatened or don't feel that their way of life is being threatened, as people, well, for example, let me give you one historical example. In the late 17th century in Massachusetts, the very, very famous Salem witch trials. If you read the story of Puritan Massachusetts during the 17th century in America, you begin to recognize very quickly that these so-called Puritans, these Congregationalists, came to the New World in order to set up what they believed was the perfect society according to the model that God had sketched out for them in Scripture. In other words, they came here for their religious freedom. But it's very, very obvious that while they came here for their religious freedom, they weren't about to extend religious freedom to anybody else. They came here to set up the ideal society as they defined it, as the preachers defined it in Scripture, as the sermons reveal it. They believed that they were on a mission from God. They believed that they had a covenant with God, and that if they fulfilled the terms of the covenant, if they did everything that they could do to set up the ideal society the way God wanted it set up, they believed that God would reward them by making sure that the community prospered. This is so evident in the sermons of John Winthrop and many of the Cotton Mather and Increase Mather and many of the other most prominent theologians during this period. But the other side of that coin was that just as they believed that they would be rewarded for doing what God wanted them to do, they also believed that they would be punished if they did not. And so, by definition, then, these are people who believed that God sent them signs as to whether they were on track or whether they were off track. And they tended to interpret positive as well as negative happenings as signs from God. Indian raids, floods, droughts, storms, an increase in children being disobedient to their parents, an increase in husbands and wives not being faithful to each other. The leaders of this community saw all of these things as signs from God that they really needed to shape up and reform themselves and work hard to constantly stick to the straight and narrow. These were the so-called Jeremiads, the sermons, the fire and brimstone sermons, the Jonathan Edwards type of sermon in early 18th century Massachusetts, where Jonathan Edwards talked about "and sinners in the hands of an angry God." The idea that every one of us is suspended on a thread, a thin thread over the pits of hell. And we are hanging on to that thread, and at any moment God could basically let go of the other end, and into the fires of hell forever and ever, for all eternity, would we go. And it was a testimony to the awesome power of God and the fact that we had better shape up and live according to the way our mission told us we needed to live, or we would be in trouble. And so the sermons tended to reflect what they saw as signals from God, positive signals, economic health, solid families, solid family units, obedient children, children doing good work in school, and all the rest of it. All the positives was seen as signs from God that they were on the right track. But naturally, it would be more the negatives that would get the attention of the preachers, of the ministers. And so these people believed that God sent signs to this community with whom he had a covenant, a deal, a contract. If you do what I want you to do, you'll be rewarded. If you don't do what I want you to do, you'll be punished. And they really believe this. And so this ultimately was the way that these people saw their relationship with God. The important thing to keep in mind is that while they came here for their religious freedom, they were not at all willing to extend that same freedom to dissenters. They banished Ann Hutchinson, they banished Roger Williams, they hung Quakers. In other words, they were on a mission from God, and that entitled them to do everything they needed to do in order to fulfill the mission which they believed brought them to the New World. And that meant protecting and preserving the religious and doctrinal integrity of what they believed. So they were not open to free speech or to dissenters or questions or anything else. And so and again, many people, as we know, continue to believe that. Many people believe today, and those people that believe in American exceptionalism are inclined to believe that American society itself is a special society created by God to fulfill a certain mission in the world. And they believe, just as the Puritans believed, that America, the United States of America, is on a special mission from God to create the perfect nation, which by definition must be a Christian nation, and to reform the world by our example. And assuming that those nations which model themselves on the way we operate are on track, and those nations that don't are off track. Consequently, it's very, very understandable, given the way these people viewed life and viewed their, what they were about as a community, as a society. It's very, very understandable that this would be a community where the witch trials would occur, because they were able to see the idea that God would punish the community by infiltrating it with witches, by allowing demons to take over control of citizens, mainly young girls, seemed to them to be very, very consistent with the way God operated. And so the fact that that there were reports of these witches in the 1690s meant that the ministers and the churches had to really toughen it up and really suck it up and get rid of these witches and get the community, get the colony back on track. Fact of the matter is, they felt threatened. They felt that everything that made life make sense to them was being threatened. Excuse me. And so they felt that what they had to do was really tighten up things. And the witch trials seemed to be in perfect sync with that kind of a worldview. History tells us then that throughout history, whenever nations feel threatened, they are much less likely or inclined to extend freedom. Academic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or anything else. When people feel that their way of life, their culture, their society is under attack, they naturally respond accordingly. The slave owners did in the South prior to the Civil War when they began to experience the attacks of abolitionists, the William Lloyd Garrisons of the nation. After World War II, when the United States we felt that our very way of life was being threatened by international communism, we entered into what we refer to as the Cold War. And we began to define communism in ways which seemed to fit the mindset of such a threat to our way of life. We believed that communists would infiltrate our society, that they would infiltrate the military, that they would infiltrate our educational institutions at all levels, that it would infiltrate our government, that they would infiltrate our defense plants and various other things. And the more threatened we felt, the more inclined we were to listen seriously to the likes of Joseph McCarthy. And we went through this horrendous period in American history in the 50s and 60s, which is usually referred to as McCarthyism. It was real. I don't know how many out there can remember back that far, but I can. I can remember in the 7th grade, federal agents walking into my math class and taking my math teacher by the arms and escorting him out of class, and I never saw him again. And that night in the Boston newspapers was a story that the FBI and the CIA and whoever else was involved in this thing had done this giant sweep through public institutions of education, through the Boston school system, and had arrested a whole series of fellow travelers, muddle-headed liberals and out acknowledged committed communists who were in our schools trying to disrupt and destroy our young people. The point I'm trying to make is when people feel threatened like that, they are much more inclined to believe conspiracies, to see threats that may or may not be there, to expand threats well beyond what the threat might really be, and on and on and on. This makes sense. Academic freedom, then, the right to have free exchange of ideas and free discussion in our colleges and universities, would obviously be directly affected by this climate of fear that seemed to typify the Cold War. I think I've mentioned before here at the Virtual Center, there was a historian, an American historian who was a graduate student, a PhD candidate at Harvard, named Gabriel Kolko, K-O-L-K-O, who wrote his dissertation on progressivism, on the progressive era at the turn of the century, specifically on the functions of the Interstate Commerce Commission and some of the other federal agencies created during the progressive era to regulate the behavior and the activities of corporate America. And what Kolko's thesis was in his dissertation was that, in effect, corporate America itself was behind much of this regulation that happened as a result of progressivism. Whereas the general impression was that corporations were trampling on the individual rights of citizens, and their government came to their rescue in terms of the creation of agencies and regulatory provisions to regulate the behavior of corporations. That seemed to be the way that most people interpreted the progressive period. What Kolko found in his research was that in reality the corporations themselves were behind much of this regulation. That corporate attorneys from various industries, railroads and factories and steel plants and coal mines and various other things, many of the people who were appointed to sit on these regulatory commissions and agencies actually were directly from the industries that were being regulated. In other words, what better way to regulate rates of railroads than to appoint railroad executives and railroad attorneys to the Interstate Commerce Commission? Because they would know the railroad business better than anybody else. They would know when regulations were positive and when they went so far to become negative. So the idea is, if you're going to regulate an industry, you turn the details of that regulation over the people who know the industry best. And those, of course, are the very people that the agency was created to regulate. And what Kolko found was that this idea of progressivism that was generally accepted throughout American society was fallacious. And that really what we were seeing was a partnership between corporate America and government, where corporate America was willing to accept some regulation provided that government let the corporations write the regulations. Throughout the history department at Harvard, this interpretation was considered, especially during the period of the 1950s, during the McCarthy period, as being un-American. And so consequently, Gabriel Kolko's dissertation was not approved. Harvard had stimulated and supported Kolko all the way through his research and his writing, and when it came to the end, because they didn't like his interpretation, they refused to accept this dissertation. And he was forced to go to another institution in order to get his degree. And since that time, his book has been published, and now most textbooks incorporate this interpretation as mainstream stuff. But in the 1950s, it was considered to be so leftist and so anti-government and so anti-corporate America that it was questionable. At the same time, entire history departments in some of our colleges and universities were terminated during this period because they were seen as too radical, too leftist. They were free thinkers, and we lived in a society where people couldn't risk couldn't risk free thinking and couldn't risk the ideal of the marketplace of ideas and the free exchange of ideas. So the point is that when nations feel threatened, they tend to tighten up on the freedoms that they are willing to extend in less trying, less stressful times. That makes perfect sense. Every society does that. Free speech. During times of war, free speech is limited. Freedom of the press is limited. Lincoln, during the Civil War, suspended the rights of habeas corpus and began to throw potential sympathizers of the Confederacy into jail without charge, without jury trial, in other words, violating all the First Amendment, all the amendment freedoms associated with the rights of citizens to be accused of a crime and have the right to an attorney and hear the evidence against them and all the rest of it. Lincoln basically rounded up the people that he felt were were Confederate sympathizers and threw them into jail. This was the way that Lincoln made sure that the so-called border states, Maryland and Missouri and Kentucky and the states right on the border between North and South, states that had slavery, did not secede with the solid South, with the Confederacy. That was the way he kept them in the Union, was to arrest the leaders of the opposition. Clearly unconstitutional. But in a time of war, courts and Congresses tend to kind of look the other way, if you know what I mean. So academic freedom as a concept seems to depend on times when societies do not feel stressed, do not feel threatened. But the fact of the matter is, if you are a confirmed academic, if you do believe in academic freedom, as I do, and you do believe in the free exchange of ideas and in the marketplace of ideas, then you have to believe that quality education can only happen when you can keep these political pressures out of the classroom. The idea being that when you, as an instructor, walk into that classroom and close that door, then what happens in that classroom between instructor and students is an open, free, unlimited, unregulated discussion and exchange in the pursuit of truth. If you believe that, then you have to believe that any interference or any limitation on academic freedom negatively impacts the quality of education itself. And that there must be a very clear, definitive line drawn between the political pressures outside the classroom and the kinds of liberties and freedom extended to people within it. That's what Stanley Fish is talking about in his essay on these Noam Chomsky lectures at Columbia University. We are at 4 minutes after the hour. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up on the details of Stanley Fish's piece. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a short break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us. This is Bill O'Brien, back with you for our second hour on the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. If you are just joining us, we welcome you to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, thank you so much for staying with us. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's area code 304-658-3333. My personal email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. O'Brien is spelled I-E-N, not I-A-N. O'Brien, waobrien906@gmail.com. We just started, if you're just joining us, we just started to look at Stanley Fish's piece. We've been talking in our last hour about the whole issue of academic freedom and the assumptions on which it's based. And the basic idea is that the only way education can really happen, the pursuit of truth, of knowledge, can really happen, is when the outside political, economic, and social pressures that make up our day-to-day lives are not allowed to intrude on the academic process itself. And I think it's very important to spend a moment and reflect on this. What that means is that not only outside pressures and issues shouldn't interfere or shouldn't play a role in the academic process, but that also includes the priorities and political prejudices of instructors and students. To be very, very blunt about it, one of the reasons why so many academics support the separation of church and state is because the whole idea of academic freedom and the pursuit of truth is contrary to the idea of religious instruction. Religion is based on faith, on belief. By definition, research and inquiry is based on the fact that there is no preconceived belief or faith going in. In other words, if you are a scientist, but you only believe in one particular approach to science, then that approach is going to dictate what you look at and what you don't, what you consider evidence and what you consider not to be evidence. And consequently, the entire scientific method itself is thrown out of whack by the belief system and the prejudices that you bring to the table. The whole idea of academic freedom is that there are no preconceived truths, and that what we are engaged in is the pursuit of truth from the very from the beginning, with no holes barred, so to speak. And so if religion is allowed to intrude into that process, then what you find is usually based on the assumptions of the particular faith that you bring to the table in the first place. And so, and it's not just religion. I mean, if an instructor makes it very clear to students that he or she is a liberal or a conservative, and that dictates how they look at the economy, how they look at education, how they look at the administration, how they look at American foreign policy, how they look at at President Obama, how they look at the stock market, how they look at the economy generally, how they look at at welfare, at social programs, how they look at entitlements, how they look at minimum wage. All of these things are directly related to whether you are a liberal or a conservative. Then by definition, that skews the whole process of academic freedom in the classroom, because there really isn't any. Because if students can clearly pick up right from the very beginning, this guy is a liberal, he likes Obama, and so therefore we have to be very careful. I have to be very careful not to say anything that's negative about Obama, or anything that's negative about Social Security, or anything that's negative about public education, or anything that's negative about the civil rights movement, or anything that's negative about unemployment insurance or minimum wage or any of these other things. In other words, if I have to make sure that my behavior is in line with what this person believes and doesn't believe, then the entire academic process breaks down. So therefore, instructors must go out of their way to keep their own political and economic prejudices out of the classroom. Because once they enter into it, then true academic freedom is no longer possible. And the same thing is true with students. If students could come in with a whole litany of preconceived beliefs, this is true, this is true, this is not true, that's not true, this is what I was always told to be true, and you go in there with that, then part of the instructor's job is to basically force students to challenge those beliefs, because true learning can't begin to happen until students are required to confront those belief systems. Otherwise, true discussion and true research is really not true at all. What you are really doing is cherry-picking evidence in order to find those things which conform to what you already believe. And you are excluding those things which don't conform to it. So therefore, you are accepting or rejecting evidence based on preconceived notions and preconceived beliefs. All of that is inconsistent with academic freedom. So the question that Stanley Fish raises in the Noam Chomsky lectures is it possible for a true teacher, a true professor, a true professional educator to separate political beliefs from academic behavior? Is it even possible for a Noam Chomsky, knowing what we know about his particular beliefs about foreign policy and the economy, education and politics and all the rest of it, is it possible for him to leave all of that outside the classroom and to close that door and really engage students within the classroom on the academic pursuit of truth and knowledge? And what drives Stanley Fish's article is that he came away from these 3 lectures delivered by Noam Chomsky convinced that indeed, in the person of Noam Chomsky, it indeed is possible. And he becomes a major fan of Noam Chomsky because of his ability to keep outside the classroom door the things that belong outside it in order to generate within the classroom only those kinds of things which pertain to the academic enterprise, which is the pursuit, the honest exchange of ideas and pursuit of truth. With that introduction, then, let me share with you Stanley Fish's definition of what he believes academic freedom and the academic process is all about. The academy, what he believes the academy is all about in the abstract. He says, the views that I've been peddling to various audiences without notable success are: 1. The academy is a world of its own, complete with rules, protocols, systems of evaluation, recognized achievements, agreed-on goals, a roster of heroes, and a list of tasks yet to be done. In other words, the position that he's been arguing all the way along about the academy is that the academy is and must remain a world of its own. It must have its own world, its own rules, its own internal system of evaluation, its own agreed-upon goals, its own heroes, its own agenda, etc. And none of the outside pressures which would affect that pursuit of truth can be allowed into that classroom. Second, academic work proceeds within the confines of that world. Within, that is, a professional, not a public space, although its performance may be and often is public. In other words, the public oftentimes sees what's going on in the classroom, but the professionalism of the instructor and the way that the instructor deals with students and runs that class is going to dictate what happens within that classroom and what should not happen. Accordingly, says Fish, number 3, academic work is only tangentially, not essentially political. Politics may attend the formation of academic units and the selection of academic personnel, but political concerns and pressures have no place in the unfolding of academic argument except as objects of its distinctive forms of attention. The only time that politics ought to enter into the classroom at all is when politics itself is the focus of the discussion. If politics is the subject which has generated the pursuit of knowledge and truth, then that's fine. I think last week when we touched on this, the example I gave were those people that will have courses in colleges and universities on the Bible, and they'll be entitled The Bible as Literature. And the whole idea being, academically, you can look at the Bible as history and literature, but if the instructor and or the students see the Bible as the place where truth exists, then true academic enterprise can't happen there. The only way that the Bible can be studied as an academic enterprise is if it's looked upon as history or as literature, but not as a Bible, not as the place where God has revealed his truths to man. The mere fact that people see the Bible that way means that the Bible cannot be the focus of academic freedom and academic enterprise. And so Fish points out that political concerns and political pressures from outside, like whether you feel your way of life is under threat, whether you feel that the greatest threat to us is communism and socialism and Marx and all the rest of it, so therefore you don't want Marx's name raised, you don't want socialism raised, you don't want an economic analysis to in any way touch on a Marxist interpretation of the economy, because Marxism is considered to be the economic system of the Antichrist, of the devil. Then what that means is you're skewing the academic process in such a way that there's no chance that anything resembling truth will ever come out of it. And Fish's fourth point is that the academic views of a professor are independent of his or her real-world political views. Academic disputes don't track partisan disputes or vice versa. You can't reason from an academic's disciplinary views to the positions he or she would take in the public sphere. They are independent variables. What a professor believes and knows to be true in the world outside the classroom must remain outside the classroom. The minute it comes in to the classroom, then that affects the pursuit of truth that the professor engages in. And the minute students pick up on it, it affects what they say and what they don't say. That's why a program like the Virtual Center here is so susceptible, and I use susceptible in a positive way, not a negative way. Here at the Virtual Center, we have the opportunity to engage in real academic discussion. And the reason for that is that when you call, I don't have any idea who you are. You may be, I'm calling you a name because you give us a name, but maybe it's not your name. But I don't have the power to grade you. I don't have the power to fail you. I don't have the power to reward you. I don't have any power at all. The only thing that exists in the conversation between you and me is what you say and what I say in return, and the exchange that we have. And if we're both exchanging points of view in order to find out where I'm right and where you think I'm wrong, and I'm trying to point out where I think you're right and where I think you're wrong, and if that's the basis of our discussion, then at the end of it, both of us leave having learned from each other. But the minute I have some power over you, whether it's a grade or a career or a degree or whatever it might be, that's going to affect what you say and what you don't say. That's going to affect the whole idea of the pursuit of truth. And so I find that that's one of the major problems in the classroom, because students know that they're going to be graded, and they know that the instructor's perception of them is critical to the final grade. And so students are hell-bent on making sure that the instructor has a good opinion of them or good impression of them or whatever. So that means don't say anything stupid, don't say anything, don't make mistakes, don't let them think that you don't know what you're talking about. So you choose your words very carefully, you choose the times and places that you speak very carefully, and nothing that's going on resembles a pursuit of truth. Rather, what we have going on here is political gamesmanship, where you're trying to impress me and I'm trying to impress you, and I'm not saying the things that I might want to say for fear that I don't want you to get you to be upset, and you're not saying the things that you might want to say to me because you're afraid because I have the red pen that I might penalize you in grading or whatever. And so the sum total is the whole exchange becomes artificial. I think that what we have here at the Virtual Center has much more potential of being academically solid than what goes on in the classroom, in our classrooms. I believe that. So that is what Stanley Fish believes the academic enterprise is all about, and I hope I've introduced it enough and well enough that it makes sense. It's very esoteric, it's very abstract, it's hard to understand, but it's very, very important. Now Stanley Fish goes on about Chomsky. He says, now as everyone knows, Noam Chomsky is a distinguished academic, a scholar who pretty much single-handedly reconfigured the discipline of linguistics, and a strong presence in the landscape of other disciplines: philosophy of mind, psychology, biology, literary criticism, to name but a few. So Chomsky has made a reputation in all of these areas. He's very, very well known in a variety of different areas. But Chomsky is also a prominent public intellectual whose opinions on a wide range of political topics, American foreign policy, the Middle East, capitalism, fossil fuels, education, etc., are well known and often controversial. So, Stanley Fish says, the question is, which Chomsky is going to show up at Columbia? Or alternatively, can you have one without the other? The answer, it turned out, is yes. Chomsky gave 3 lectures under the general title, What Kind of Creatures Are We? The answer given in the first lecture, What is Language?, is that we are creatures with language, and that language, as a uniquely human biological capacity, appeared suddenly and quite late in the evolutionary story, perhaps 75,000 years ago. Language, then, does not arise from the social cultural environment, although the environment provides the stuff or input it works on. That input is impoverished, Fish says. Chomsky said. It can't account for the creativity of language performance, which has its source not in the empirical world, but in an innate ability that is more powerful than the stimuli it utilizes and plays with. Translation, as best I can. I'm not a linguist. But what Fish seems to be saying in this summary of Chomsky's first lecture is that Chomsky's position is that language is not the product of the culture or the social environment of the society which practices that language. That instead, language is a biological part of the human makeup. It comes from within the human being. It's affected by the society and the culture and the priorities of the world into which it is introduced. But the substance of language comes from within the human being. It follows, Fish says, that if you want to understand language, you shouldn't look to linguistic behavior, but to the internal mechanism, the universal grammar, of which particular linguistic behaviors are a non-exhaustive expression. So in other words, what we see and hear from language is what comes from within the human being, but only after it's filtered through the priorities of the society and the culture within which this is happening. But the language itself is innately human and it's biological. It's part of the human makeup. It's not something that all forms of life have. There's something uniquely human about it because it provides or gives us the ability to communicate with each other. And many people believe, many historians believe, that history as we know it as a discipline doesn't begin until man is able to basically record the world in which he lives and transmit it to future generations. That, to many historians, is where history begins. So it's not a figment of the culture or the society or the economic system or anything else. Those things obviously affect it. But language itself is a product of the biological makeup of human beings. I think that I'm walking on thin ice here, but I believe that's what he's talking about. That's the summary of the first lecture that Noam Chomsky gives about language. In his second lecture, which is entitled, What Can We Understand?, Chomsky took up the question of what humans are capable of understanding. And his answer generally was that we can understand what we can understand. And that means that we can't understand what is beyond our innate mental capacities. In other words, our ability to understand as human beings is finite. It has an end. It goes so far and no further. What that means is that we can understand some things, but there are probably some things that are true that we can't understand. This does not mean, Chomsky said, that what we can't understand is not real. What is mysterious to me is not an argument that it does not exist. It's just that while language is powerful and creative, its power and creativity have limits. And since language is thought rather than an addition to or clothing of thought, the limits of language are the limits of what we can fruitfully think about. So in other words, the link between language and what we can understand is that language is the ability to define and to describe what we understand. And just as what we understand has limits, so also does language have limits. Nor, Chomsky declared, are those limits capable of being enlarged or transcended in time. This is as good as it gets, he says. There is no evolution in our capacity for language. In other words, what we are capable of with language is what we are doing, and that's it. Chomsky goes on, these assertions are offered as a counter to what Chomsky sees as an over-optimistic Enlightenment belief, and this I know about, common to many empiricist philosophies, that ours is a limitless explanatory power and that we can do anything. This is the optimism of the Enlightenment, that once man begins to realize that he has reason and he can understand the universe and the world he lives in, then the next logical step to that is that man, because man now knows that he can know, therefore the implication is man's ability to know and understand is unlimited. And Chomsky says, absolutely not. Our ability to understand is limited, and in part what limits it is language. We can only understand what we can define and describe. And when we get to the point where we can't define and describe any longer, there ends our ability to understand. Our limits, he concluded, should not be lamented, for the fact of limits enables perception and predication. If there were no limits, everything would be mush, and there'd be no scope for definite action. And then here, Fish quotes Wordsworth's sonnet, nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room. Have you ever heard that? I think that is beautiful. Nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room. Just because nuns live in quarters in convents, which are very, very narrow, very small, and very carefully defined, Wordsworth's sonnet says that this doesn't bother nuns because it creates definite parameters and limits within which they function and live. And they can understand that. So that's the second lecture, what can we understand? And then in the third lecture, entitled What is the Common Good?, Chomsky turned from the philosophy of mind and language to political philosophy and the question of what constitutes a truly democratic society. He likened dogmatic intellectual structures that interfere with free inquiry to coercive political structures that stifle the individual's creative independence and fail to encourage humanity's rich diversity. He asserted that any institution marked by domination and hierarchy must rise to the challenge of justifying itself, and if it cannot meet the challenge, it should be dismantled. He contrasted two accounts of democracy, one associated by him with James Madison, distrusts the unwashed populace and puts its faith in representative government where those doing the representing and the voting and the distributing of goods constitute a moneyed and propertied elite. In other words, there is the approach to democracy which Madison advocates, which is representative government, where the people that do the representing are not the people who are represented. That's the way you account for the distinctions within society. The other approach to democracy associated by him with Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, the 1960s, and the tradition of anarchists writing, seeks to expand the franchise and multiply choices in the realms of thought, politics, and economics. The impulse of this second libertarian strain of democracy is to free society from economic or theological guardianship, and by theological, Chomsky meant not formal religion as such, but any assumed or frozen ideology that blocked inquiry and limited participation. The libertarian approach to democracy that Chomsky is talking about here is not a society where a few people are the most qualified, therefore they're the ones that do the representing. The vast majority of people are not equally qualified, therefore they are the ones that are represented. That's one approach. But Chomsky, in his libertarian approach to democracy, is based on the idea that democracy ought to be open and that there ought to be no limits, nothing frozen, no givens at the beginning, anything that would block entry and limit participation. In other words, the idea is that true democracy means the more people participate, the better the system works. And the idea that everybody is equal, everybody has value, etc. There can't, in short, Chomsky said, be too much democracy. So those are his three lectures. What is language? What can we understand? What is the common good? Now, here's Stanley Fish's analysis of each of these three lectures. I was enchanted, even ravished, by these lectures, not because I agreed with the positions they staked out, but because of the spectacle they presented of an intelligence exercising itself on a set of significant philosophical questions. What Fish had seen in these three lectures was the academy in action, the ideal. It was thought of the highest order performed by a thinker. Let me repeat that. It was thought of the highest order performed by a thinker. Now 85 years old, who by and large eschewed rhetorical flourishes. He has called his own speaking style boring and says he likes it that way, and just did it, where it was the patient exploration of deep issues that had been explored before him by a succession of predecessors, fully acknowledged, in a conversation that is forever being continued and forever being replenished. This was as close as Fish has ever seen to true academic freedom in action, where these deep, significant philosophical questions were the focus of discussion, and everything everybody said was determined and generated by those questions. Yes, I said to myself, this is what we, those of us who bought a ticket on this particular train, do. This is what all of us in academia hope to accomplish. This is what we do. We think about problems and puzzles and try to advance the understanding of them. And we do that kind of thinking because its pleasures are, in a strong sense, athletic, and provide for us, at least on occasion, the experience of fully realizing what capabilities we might have. And we do it in order to have that experience and to share it with colleagues and students of like mind, and not to make a moral or a political point. We are not looking to end the discussion. We are looking to extend it forever, because there's always more to be learned. Fish goes on. As I listened, I imagined a member of the audience, at least in the first two lectures, who came to hear a disquisition on the nature of language and mind, and left with an understanding of what had been said, but without knowing anything of Chomsky's political beliefs, political views. He didn't allow any of that to penetrate any of these three lectures. At first glance, it might seem to be different in the case of the third lecture, which addressed an explicitly political topic, namely democracy. But here, too, the mode of interrogation was more analytic than polemical. The two concepts of democracy were laid out and explicated by reference to the distinguished expositors. This is Madison's, this is Adam Smith's. To be sure, it was clear which one Chomsky preferred, but that preference led to no particular political recommendation, only the recommendation that we should strive for social arrangements that are conducive to the rights and welfare of people. The purpose of democracy is to promote the rights and welfare of people. That's all that this was about, no more. That, however, is, as Chomsky observed, a universally accepted truism. Everybody accepts this. It would be hard, Fish said, to imagine someone on the other side standing up for social arrangements that had the effects of undermining a citizenry's welfare and violating its rights. Although, of course, there are plenty of governments that do that. One could, of course, draw a line from the truism to a criticism of particular regimes and policies. But that Chomsky declined to do, except in the question and answer period, where students who were eager for a political payoff asked him pointed questions of the kind he avoided during the lectures. How can we ameliorate inequality? What do you think of the situation in Venezuela? What's your view of educational reform? He answered firmly but mildly and got off a few zingers, one of which I couldn't agree with more. Educational reform, Chomsky said, is a euphemism for the destruction of public education. So the political Chomsky did show up, but only at the very end, and not in a way that compromised the essential academic tenor of the event, the academic integrity of the three lectures. Finally, and this is the last paragraph, at the conclusion of each lecture, Chomsky received a thundering round of applause. By the third day, the applause was deafening and sustained. It refused to stop. The applause, I am certain, was not for the specific points being made, points Chomsky's been making in some form for more than 50 years, but for the exemplary nature of his performance. The term master class is a bit overused, but I feel no hesitation in using it here. It was a master class taught by a master. And if someone were to ask me, what exactly is it that academics do, I would point to these lectures and I would say simply, here it is. Here's the thing itself. This is probably the 5th time that I have read this piece, and I still tingle. Because what we have here is a classic example. My first reaction, in fact, I sent it as an attachment on an email to 3 or 4 of my friends and colleagues. I think everybody who teaches in the classroom ought to read this essay. I have to acknowledge that a lot of people, unfortunately, will probably not be able to understand it. But for those who would, this is one of the most important essays that I've ever read. It defines academic freedom. It tells us what ought to happen in the classroom and why something like academic freedom is even necessary. Because by inference, it suggests those aspects of the educational enterprise that do not qualify for the protections and the privileges of academic freedom. The liberal professor who goes into a class and lectures in such a way that a particular point of view is being defended over and over and over again in class after class after class, to the point that there's no student who doesn't know exactly what the professor believes about everything. And consequently, the student's conclusion is, what I must be careful to do is make sure that everything I say is going to be something that this particular instructor is going to want to hear, and to make sure that nothing I say is something that the instructor does not want to hear. Once a class reaches that point, the pursuit of truth is no more. Too many instructors believe that academic freedom is the right to say whatever they want to say in their classroom because it's their classroom. I would suggest to you that this essay by Stanley Fish makes very clear that in no way is that what academic freedom is about. Not only that, but it also indicates that the people who practice that, people who believe that academic freedom gives me the right as the professor to say anything I want to say, and nobody can interfere with me because I'm in the classroom and I have a right to academic freedom. These people are the greatest threat to academic freedom because they are responsible for bringing the kind of pressure on the academy which makes institutions and publics and media less inclined to support academic freedom as a positive good. And the fact of the matter is, academic freedom as the principal ingredient of the academy is the only positive good. Once you allow the political pressures of the world outside to enter that classroom, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, when they met at Philadelphia in May, one of the first decisions they made is that what happens in this room stays in this room. What happens in Vegas stays in Las Vegas. They made an agreement to not allow the discussions, who said what, to get outside that room. Because the fear was, once the members of the convention began to play to the media and play to the public and want to look popular, then the task before them, which was to create a government that would work, became impossible. The only way to have people honestly exchange ideas and offer perceptions and points of view and allow what we call the marketplace of ideas to really work, the only way to guarantee it was to do the best they could to make sure that what happened in that room stayed in that room and nobody outside knew who said what. Now, of course, it's naive to believe that these people didn't talk. There were some delegates, especially the anti-federalists, who went there, when they finally left the convention, they didn't stop talking from the minute they walked out, because they kept saying, you won't believe what's going on in there. You won't believe what these guys are trying to do to the Articles of Confederation and to the power of our states and to the rights of our state constitutions and governments to protect the liberty of our citizens and all the rest of it. So there's the ideal and there's the reality, and we know that. But the fact of the matter is that when they made the decision that the debates would be conducted in secret, it was their effort to keep the political pressures outside that convention hall outside, so that people could honestly exchange ideas and points of view inside. That is a classic example of what the pursuit of truth is all about. The free exchange of ideas and points of view and perceptions and all the rest of it. And if you come in with a preconceived set of beliefs, obviously, in many cases, they would tend to be religious. If you come in and you come in believing that this is true, that what the Bible says happened really happened, and you believe that as absolute truth because it's in the Bible, then how can you honestly engage in exchange with other people who don't believe the same thing that you believe? That's what the Puritans were doing. The Puritans came here for their religious freedom. They set up their own society based on the premises and the mission that they believed they were on. But they did not believe in free speech or dissent or anything like that. The purpose of this society was to put their heads together, read Scripture, and try to understand what God wanted them to do and make that the agenda. And anybody who questioned it or anybody who disagreed or dissented had to go. Because to be very honest with you, given the mission that they believed they were on, to allow dissent to go on unchallenged would bring punishment from God. They believed that God would punish them for that. So consequently, they felt that they had to hang Quakers and execute witches and all of that. That's what the academic freedom, that's what the academic enterprise is all about. That's what academia is all about. That's what goes on behind those ivory walls is all about in theory. The point is, going back to Chomsky's third lecture on the kinds of democracy, there are two kinds. One is based on the assumption that everybody is not equal and that certain people are more capable of making decisions than other people. Therefore, these are the people, the few, who do the representing and who make the decisions about the distribution of goods and services and who control elections. Everybody else, you got to find a way for them to participate, but you can't give them the same power that the few have because you believe going in that the few have superior abilities and talents. If you are a committed Democrat, which is Chomsky's second approach to democracy, then you believe that anything which expands participation and increases the democratic procedure is a positive good. Whatever the outcome, whatever the result. The assumption is if everybody participated, then the decision is the right one. The system produces truth. Procedure. The proper procedure is the most direct way to truth and knowledge. So in other words, it's not who has it and who doesn't. It's the basic assumption that everybody contributing to the marketplace of ideas is contributing to the pursuit of truth. Therefore, anything you can do to expand that degree of participation is a positive good. It's very obvious which of those two our republic is based upon. I would suggest to you the controversy and the conflict in our society is principally between those who are comfortable with Madison's approach to democracy, which is representative democracy, and the libertarian approach, which seeks to question it and seeks to advocate a different way. That becomes the political basis of debate in our society. We are at 59 minutes after the hour. All I can say in conclusion is, what an article. Have a wonderful week. Be careful. Be safe. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you.